It's honestly hard to imagine the giant role that Ihsan Abdel Quddous played in the creation of Arab culture in the 20th century. He was the most popular and prolific writer of Arab fiction in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, hundreds and hundreds of short stories, 60 books in total, and even movies. Almost 50 classics of Egyptian cinema were adapted from this fiction.
He is like Stephen King, Anna Wintour, Lorne Michaels, J.K. Rowling, Alfred Hitchcock, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, like, loaded into one person.
The critics hated him. He was never appreciated by the literate set.
Why was he jailed in 1954?
He sees himself as responsible for turning Egypt into a military dictatorship. That's it. He realizes, this is not what I signed up for. And by the first anniversary of the coup, there's clearly a systematic decision to erase him.
Welcome to the afikra podcast. My name is Mike Imhenna. Today on the series, we have Professor Jonathan Smolin from Dartmouth College, who is the author of a book, The Politics of Melodrama, which looks at the life and work of Ihsan Abdel Quddous. Jonathan, welcome to the series.
It's an honor to be here, Mikey. I love the podcast. It really is a delight, and thrilled to have the opportunity to be here with you and to talk about this book.
Okay, amazing. I'm excited to have you here. Let's start with the basic question, which is, who was this person for the uninitiated? Like, why write a book about this person? Explain who he is.
You know, in today's fractured media cultural environment, it's honestly hard to imagine the kind of giant role that Ihsan Abdel Quddous played in the creation of Arab culture in the 20th century. He was the most popular and prolific writer of Arab fiction, of fiction in Arabic, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. He published hundreds and hundreds of short stories, over 20 novels, 60 books in total. All of this fiction was serialized in the press first, and then was republished into dozens of editions. The fiction was then adapted into radio plays, which were incredibly popular, into TV series, and even movies. Almost 50 classics of Egyptian cinema were adapted from this fiction. But that's just the fiction part. He was also the editor-in-chief of the most important magazines in Egypt in the 1950s and 60s. He was in charge of Al-Ahram in the 70s. And so he's one of, if not the most prominent journalists in Egypt of the 20th century as well. And he had a huge a political voice in terms of his editorials and engagement. He was very close with presidents of Egypt and so on and so forth. So, it's impossible to understand Egyptian or even Arab culture in the 20th century without understanding him and without, knowing about his work and his background.
It's funny because, like, you're describing him, he's like, in one guy, he is like Stephen King, Anna Wintour, Lorne Michaels, J.K. Rowling, Alfred Hitchcock, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, like, loaded into one person.
I'm so glad you said that, because actually this is the way that I try to explain who he is. So because of course outside, and something we'll talk about today, he's not known, or at least not until, my translations of his fiction and his book hopefully will make him better known outside of the Arab world. But, there's such an incredible dichotomy between like how popular and what a unique figure he is in the Arab world, and how hard it is for Americans, or English speakers to understand, how wide-ranging and important and central, a figure he is. And so you have to combine him, just like you suggest, to understand why he's so important and who he is. And we haven't even talked about the kind of the scandal and the way that he wrote about women's liberation at a time in which it was a huge taboo, and the way that he, in a sense, helped construct a new conception of gender and women's identity and freedom and liberation in the 50s and 60s. So it's like, we also have to throw in there perhaps Gloria Steinem. I mean, and I'm not sure who would be the analogy, but, he's so central. And one of the joys that's been, joys that I've had about writing about this project is that it's not at all just an intellectual project. I can talk about it with my friends' aunts and my friends' grandmothers and their, the older generation, and especially women.
Yeah. So let's do some of the basics, the sort of like who, what, where, when. So tell me about the family he was born into, the Egypt he was born into, um, and how he got his start.
So his mother was Rose al Yusuf, and Rose al Yusuf herself had an incredible life. She was a famous stage actress up until the 1920s, when she, at a time in which it was incredibly difficult for women to be, prominent stage actresses. And she then moved to create this, or then shifted her career to create this magazine called Rose al Yusuf, which was her kind of, her public name. And this magazine went on to become the most important political, cultural magazine of Egypt in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And um, and
And she
so
was
he
managing editor the entire time.
she owned it. And so she ruled that magazine with a tight fist. So she wasn't the editor in chief, but she controlled the editorial, she controlled, the purse strings, she controlled everything about it.
Was
And
it normal
so
for a woman in those decades to have such a strong business role?
Not at all. And to be
Yeah.
honest, like someone out there needs to write a full book about her because she is such an interesting, amazing woman. And she was not just, had these, in the theater with this progressive magazine, right? But she was also this kind of icon of women's progressivism, as you can imagine. And she was, part of the liberal politics of the era, was very engaged in political dissent. She went to jail a number of times, for political dissent in the magazine. The magazine got shut down by authorities a number of times, and she would then relaunch it under new names, for little periods when it was banned. She was just an incredible figure, and this incredibly strong woman in an era, of course, in which there were no parallels for her at that time. But his parents divorced. His parents divorced basically, when he was a baby, and so he grew up in this environment in which, at least at first, he grew up with his father's sister, his aunt, and his father's father, which is a very conservative household. And so he grew up in this conservative household, but he was still kind of engaged with his mother. He didn't know actually his mother was his mother until he was, I think, 10 years old. She would come and visit sometimes, and he was told that she was his aunt, right? Because, in conservative circles, she was a pariah, right? Because an actress was not a respectable profession at that time. And the kind of the public facing role that she had was also, again, not something seen as respectable among conservative families. And he would later say that it was the tensions between this incredibly conservative environment that he grew up in, with very strict, strict environment and traditional values and so on and so forth, with his grandfather and his aunt, his paternal aunt, and the tensions between that and the lifestyle of his mother and the kind of life, the world of his mother. And as he became a teenager, he began spending much more time with his mother at the magazine and her social milieu, which meant all of the actors and the musicians and the journalists and the writers. And so he got this incredible, introduction to the cultural, the culture of the Arab world at that time in a way that is, hard to imagine today because his mother was such a pillar of journalism and popular culture at that time.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about like this sort of the literary tradition that he's born into in Egypt, Ihsan? Like,
So what's interesting
was
is
there a template that he was sort of like using?
yes. And actually, this is one thing that's very hard to understand today. If you go to like a bookstore and you see his books, you see like the shelf, right? And you see all of this work that he's published as individual books, right? But that is not how it originally appeared. Everything that he published originally appeared in this magazine. So he started working for his mother's magazine when he was a teenager. He began writing little essays, and I went and found them, and they're adorable, full of youthful anxiety. Um, But as he began writing more in the magazine, he's someone who was fully acculturated to, writing in a magazine context, right? And at that time, you have to understand that magazines, they weren't dependent on advertising for their revenue. They were dependent on circulation. That's is essential to understanding him. And that these magazines, they had a weekly deadline, right? So he his environment is not the high literary culture of these giants, even though he met them and he was aware of them and he read them. But his kind of school of or education for writing was the weekly deadline. It was circulation. It was bringing in an audience. It was thinking of writing as something that was, not necessarily sensational, but his writing is full of sensationalism. But it was something that would boost circulation and bring audience to the magazine, right? That's essential for him. So his peers, or his kind of, even though he's working with giants, or he's familiar, or has in some ways, and sometimes publishing in the same magazine with people like Tawfiq al-Hakim or Naguib Mahfouz or so on and so forth. These are not his literary peers. His environment is
according to them or according to him.
According to him. So if you go back in the 1940s and read his editorials from that time, or his cultural pieces, he says, oh, they're friends and I love them, like Taha Hussein, for example, the so-called dean of Arabic literature. But he makes fun of their writing. He literally makes fun of their writing, and he says that their writing is like no one can read it, that this is for the elite, and my writing in this magazine is for the public.
Yeah,
say that again?
It's overly precious.
Exactly. It's not just overly precious, it's difficult to read. You have to remember, this is an environment in which literacy is not the same as today. Literacy rates are much lower. And so he saw fiction as a way of kind of expanding literacy, of bringing a public into the magazine, that fiction for him was a kind of vehicle for bringing people who wouldn't necessarily read a political magazine, but bought the magazine because they wanted short stories, or they wanted sensationalism, or they wanted some kind of cultural thing that was interesting. So he is a product of the Nahda of the 19th century, right? In the early 20th century. He's someone who's looking at the press as a way of expanding literacy, as a kind of a site for contestation and debate, for bringing in the public for political education. But he's doing that through some political editorials, yes, and we can talk about that later, but he's especially doing it through his fiction, which is meant to kind of attract an audience that couldn't even, or would have a hard time reading Taha Hussein or Naguib Mahfouz, for example.
I love it because it's kind of similar to, sometimes you hear like Broadway actors talk about Hollywood, or about sort of like film, like art house actors, and they'll be like, we do this 8 shows a week, like there's no like the volume erases any sort of preciousness or like delicacy that you have to be with. You have to understand how to do this at scale and iron out any sort of like delicate friction that's there. Just like, you got to know how to speak to people.
I mean, Mikey, people can get used to anything, right? I mean, and so he got used to the weekly deadline. That was his life from the late 30s, early 40s until the 80s. I mean, he spent decades on just the weekly deadline. He got used to it. The background, the elephant in the room here is that the critics hated him. Right? He was never appreciated by the literate set. Except, he was friends with, again, he was close with, Taha Hussein and Tawfiq al-Hakim and these other giants, right? But the critics, the professors, the kind of, the literary set, hated him. And there are many reasons for this, which we can get into. And one of them is that he wrote on deadline. The thing that's impossible to imagine, right? At least for me, it's impossible to imagine, is that these massive novels that he wrote, these 1,500-page novels that he wrote each chapter like a couple hours, on Friday nights. He just would go into the office on Friday night, write the entire chapter, and then submit the magazine, where it was serialized, Rose al Yusuf or Sabah al Khair, where it was serialized to the printer on Saturday morning. But on the other hand, there are times when you read him closely, you can see elements of repetition, or, okay, if he had had a little more time to kind of massage this, maybe it would have been a little smoother, or so on and so forth. I mean, Naguib Mahfouz, every novel that he wrote was perfected and massaged and polished and then serialized, right? This is a very different environment. And so, that's essential to keep in mind about him, is that quality of the work, when you only see it as books, isn't obvious. Whereas when you read it in the magazine and you read these kind of weekly installments and you start thinking about them as intersected and interconnected with other things in the magazine, which he begins editing. His mother, by the way, puts him in charge of the magazine in the 40s, right? And so, he's editing the whole magazine for the week, and he only has free time on Friday night to write this chapter or this installment of whatever novel he's in the middle of writing or serializing.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about the 40s because in 1948 he fights. In the 1948 Palestine War, how does that shape his sort of worldview? Is it in line? Is that a clear demarcation of changing the way he thinks about politics and what he thinks about Egypt and the Arab world and his role in it?
Well, he doesn't. He never fights in war. He never actually fights in Palestine. At least not with a rifle. And he does go to Palestine. There is an incredible.
He enlists in the army.
No, he does not.
He does not. Okay.
No, he does not.
I misunderstood that.
But he does not. But he does do it. He does travel to Palestine for the magazine. I think it's in 1947, and he writes a travelogue of his experience. So for those of you who are interested, go back to 1947 and Rose al Yusuf. It's a fascinating, travelogue, a kind of rehla of of this incredibly pivotal historical time. But just because he doesn't enlist in the army doesn't mean that he's not intensely involved, right? So as a journalist, he's someone that basically throughout the 1940s, he's someone who sees the political class as intensely corrupt. And he's someone who is calling for revolution. And in a variety of ways, in very explicit terms that I cover in my book, he's saying that the entire system needs to be wiped clean. There needs to be a cleansing. And, he's calling for it repeatedly. And so this is his, he's incredibly passionate about this in this way that I cover in the book. And he gets involved, there are political assassinations at the time. He's not involved in a political assassination, but he does harbor a very famous political assassin. And then in of course, we know of 1948, 49, the war in Palestine. But what he does do, and I think this is what you're referring to, is that he breaks a scandal, which is called the rotten weapons scandal. And the rotten weapons scandal is his, in a sense, his major commitment to trying to overthrow the regime. So in 1949, he starts getting, information, and then 1950, he gets more information that's leaked to him in 1950 by members of the Free Officers, right? Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat and others. And he gets these documents that are leaked to him that basically show that King Farouk of Egypt, he had armed the Egyptian army with faulty weapons, that he had purchased these weapons from an armed dealer in Spain at hugely inflated prices, okay? But these were all like rifles that shot in reverse and grenades that exploded when, you touched them, right? They were incredibly faulty. And so he sent the Egyptian army, at least the kind of the scandal goes, he sent the Egyptian army into the field with these rifles that was essentially, they were going to their unwitting suicide, right? And King Farouk is pocketing these huge kickbacks from, purchasing these weapons at these massively inflated prices. So Ihsan, this breaks, and he breaks the story in 1950. And, this for him is the crystallization of just how corrupt this the palaces and the political classes, and how self-evident it was that there had to be a revolution, that the country was this corrupt. And so this scandal was, there was nothing like this at the time, because of course it not only crystallized the corruption of the regime, but it also it crystallized the corruption of the regime, but it also showed, it also put him in contact with the free officers. But it also was, his magazine, he broke the scandal in his magazine. And then, it inflamed the public, right? They were absolutely outraged at this. And he used this scandal to try to push the free officers and Gamal Abdel Nasser, I think, in particular, to stage a coup, right? And so this was, from his perspective, this was his role. He didn't fight in Palestine, but this was something that, this was his role in trying to, so-called, fight the war, right? And to change the country.
So I want to ask you this. So in the 40s, if let's say like 1949 or the end of the 40s, he's plays a really big role in the magazine. He is a columnist. People know about him. He has a voice. He has a platform. He has sort of an activist political voice in
Very
his
much
editorials. So. Okay. If I were to have a cup of coffee with him and I asked him, hey, listen, what is the biggest problem with King Farouk? What are the major issues? Is it just because he's a king? Is it just because he's rich? What's the biggest problem? What are the biggest problems in Egypt right now? What would he say?
Well, I think he would say that the corruption of the palace, that the palace is co-opted by the British, colonial authorities. I think he would say that there's extreme wealth inequality. I think he would say that this is an era an era in which we have to have democracy, and which you have to have an entirely new political system. So, it is actually striking parallel in some ways for aspects of what we're living through today. In other words, there is, the younger generation today believes, just with some, some frequency, that the system needs to be wiped away, that the system is inherently corrupt, right? And he was someone in the 40s who truly believed that. And he's very explicit. I also want to be clear. His editorials after his jailing in 1954 to become something completely different. But
why was he jailed in 1954?
Well, hold that thought for a second.
Yeah.
And so, but in the 1940s, it's like you wouldn't have to read many editorials for him to answer your question. He would say that Egypt is a failed country, that the political class is failed, and he would also frame it in a kind of I think in a framing of masculinity. In other words, that this is not a country of real men anymore, that they've become submissive, that the country has been dominated, that it
by
needs
the British,
to
you're talking
that's
about.
right, that it needs to be, that it's been dominated, that it needs to rise up and seize agency and seize its destiny and its future, right? And so to get to the 54 jailing, you have to understand what happens in the coup. So he sees himself as responsible for preparing the Egyptian public to embrace the coup when it comes in July of 1952. So when the coup came, right, when it actually happened, in the early hours of the morning, Nasser called Ihsan, on the telephone and said, "Come down to the barracks," right? And we've finally moved, right? And so Ihsan goes to the barracks and participates with the free officers in the coup. This is something that's not well known about him. But
what do you mean by he participates? What does that mean?
He is there with them in the barracks as they're kind of navigating the whole process of the coup, of getting of deciding who's going to be the transitional prime minister. He goes to offer the transitional prime minister position to Ali Maher on behalf of the free officers. Remember, there are no cell phones.
Part of the administration.
He's part of he's with them. He's going with Sadat to, on the day of the coup to offer the prime minister position to the first prime minister after the coup. He's there as they're talking on the phone with the King Farouk's representatives to get him to, to resign, right? And so he's fully there. And there's a narrative that he writes about this just a couple weeks after, he does it, where he says, I realized that if this coup failed, that if this failed, that I was going to be hung along with them, that this was my life, right? I and my family they're all going to be hung, right? Because I participated in this coup. He believes that he's a full participant in it, right? That he is the civilian free officer. Now, I want to be clear, just because he believed it doesn't mean that the free officers saw him in the same way, right? And we don't know for sure. Yeah.
I want to ask a question about this. We're going to get to him being jailed in a second. But to me, at least in this conversation, he kind of seems a little naive.
yeah, right. Well,
he kind of seems, to me, as somebody who lives in Lebanon and has conversations with a lot of people who have a lot of intellectual horsepower and are able to produce stuff and push stuff out there and think intellectually, sometimes they kind of live in fairy tale land. And they live in this idealistic world, mindscape.
Yes. So I want to be fair here. He's clearly very emotional and passionate, right? This is not someone who's meditating, and practicing mindfulness, right? He is really engaged and swept, in his emotions and passions. Okay. So let's be clear about that. The other thing is that it's very easy to look back in 2025 and judge him as naive, but he didn't have the benefit of what's going to happen. There was no kind of Arab military dictatorship yet, right? And he was someone who truly believed, and he wasn't the only one. I covered this in my book, that Gamal Abdel Nasser was just a docile, submissive figure who would do what he said. Right. And there are other figures who believe this about Nasser before the coup, that bringing Nasser to power, bringing the free officers to power would mean that they would just do what, Ihsan, for example, wanted. Right. And the Muslim Brotherhood believed this too about the free officers, that they were just going to implement their program. And what everyone discovers after the coup is that Nasser is, as he says, his own man, and he's not going to do what they say. But yes, you can see he's painfully not, yes, there's a painful tragedy here. And that's the bulk of my book, which is exploring his sense of regret and despair for what he felt like was his personal responsibility for turning Egypt into a military dictatorship, right? That is ultimately what his fiction is about, or at least the lens through which I'm analyzing his fiction. But to go back to 1952, when you read his editorials from July and August and September, he thinks that his revolution has succeeded. He thinks these guys are just handsome, masculine military figures that are there to cleanse the system. They're going to listen to him because he's meeting with them every single day, like he's their kind of civilian advisor, and they're going to do what he says, and then they're going to withdraw. This is honestly what he thinks. Now, I cover in the book the way that there are some, red flags here. And he does seem to be aware that there are some red flags, but he's pushing forward anyway. And so it's important to say that, yes, he was intensely emotional about this. And, yes, we could say that he was naive, but he didn't have the benefit of history. And I think he saw this as the one kind of gamble for how to transform the country. And I think he thought that the free officers were just young. And they were young, right? That they were naive and docile and submissive, that they would do what he said. And he wasn't the only one. So I think, to be fair to him, we need to keep that in mind.
Okay, I want to get to why he was arrested. And then I want to ask you about the Suez crisis.
Sure.
Okay, so let's talk about why he was arrested.
So he's arrested. So, he, up until September, October, he is like the front person for kind of trying to tell the public, embrace the free officers. They're gonna install democracy. We have rule of law now, or we're going to have rule of law thanks to them, right? And he's going on the radio and giving speeches. He's writing editorials. He's doing public conferences. He has a huge cachet already in 1952.
He's like Trump's Fox News. He's just like telling the story.
So I think it's a little unfair, right?
No, I mean, I'm not with no judgment whatsoever.
Okay,
I mean,
yeah,
like
so no judgment whatsoever.
but he's state radio basically.
Absolutely. I mean, or let me rephrase this. He's someone who is using, and ironically, he writes in the before the coup, let the man come to cleanse the system away, to cleanse the system and wipe it all away. And when that man does, I will use my platform to support him 100%. He says this before the coup. And when the coup happens, he does it. He uses the magazine every week and his editorials and his colleagues' editorials. He goes on the radio. Again, he is just the civilian spokesperson for and there are others too. He's not the only one. I want to be clear about that. But that's what he's doing. And basically all seems to be going to plan, though there are red flags here and there if you read it closely, up until October. And by October, he seems to be, because the coup's in July. By October 1952, he seems to realize, oh, wait a minute, these guys aren't the docile, submissive, people that I thought. And he starting to dissent. He starts seeing this. I would never support military dictatorship. I would only support democracy. If this is military dictatorship, I withdraw my support, right? And you start seeing this stuff building up until the winter, until like December, January. And then at which point that's it. He realizes, oh, this is not what I signed up for. And, remember, I can only reconstruct the story based on the material that I have today. And much of this history is oral, it's experienced, it was either, if there were notes, they're gone, so you have to kind of, do your best with what we have. But what's clear is that by winter of 53, he is persona non grata. That we go from daily meetings and he's out there supporting them, in every way imaginable. And then by the winter, he is just completely, marginalized. And all of a sudden there, the dissent, kind of comes and goes, but it's, he's clearly very upset and very angry. And by the first anniversary of the coup, in July 1953, right, there's clearly a systematic decision to erase him. In other words, he was celebrated as this kind of the central figure to try to compel the public to embrace the coup in July 52, and by July 53, in all the narratives, the kind of official 1-year anniversary narratives of how did we get here, there's no mention of the rotten weapons. That scandal is just kind of erased, right? He's erased. There's no mention of him participating in the coup. He's just systematically erased. And this is one reason why people don't know this story, is that you'd have to be, unless you kind of went back and dug this stuff up or kept the magazines from this period, you would have to have been alive and that the 52 to understand his role, because by summer of 53, he's erased. There's no kind of acknowledgement of his participation or role in this. And it's at this point that he realizes, like, I was this, if he was the one who brought them to power, or so he thinks, then he was the one then who embedded military dictatorship, not just to kind of prepare the public for the coup, but to urge them to embrace the free officers, right, in the months afterwards. And I think he feels, whether he's giving himself this outsized, role or outsized responsibility or not, we could kind of set that aside. I think he feels this, and I think he feels profound regret and despair at what his role was in transforming Egypt. And so essentially he basically, I mean, I cover this history in my book, but he basically withdraws because it's a scary time. There are people of the old regime are put on trial, people are being arrested, there's heavy clamping down on freedom of expression. It's a very scary time. But there's a famous, period in March of '54 called the March Crisis, where Mohammed Naguib, the first president, and Nasser, they kind of come to conflict, in this ultimate clash between these two personalities, and Nasser winds up being victorious in this conflict, and then he goes on from there, and Naguib is basically under house arrest starting in the fall, for pretty much the rest of his life. But in March of '54, all of a sudden, the censorship rules were abolished. And so in March of '54, Ihsan publishes 3 editorials that are the kind of full throttle, critique and dissent against military dictatorship. Because up before that, again, there was heavy censorship. And, he takes advantage of this kind of 3-week window where there's no censorship to just lay into Nasser and lay into what's happening. And once Nasser kind of takes control of this conflict with Naguib, he then goes on the revenge tour, and, Ihsan is arrested and jailed for what he wrote in these editorials, just to make sure that, from Nasser's perspective, that Ihsan didn't see himself as an important source of dissent.
So how was his role in the late 40s and early 50s forgotten, but his importance remained?
When I say forgotten, I really mean that, his role in the coup itself, his relationship with the free officers.
That portion was.
Yeah. So what happened was, what's interesting is that, remember, he is this incredible giant still. I mean, even early in 1954. And so essentially, he's the editor-in-chief of the most important magazine. He's still publishing fiction. Excuse me. And so essentially what happens is Nasser jails him and then releases him in this narrative that I start the book off with, where, Ihsan is taken out of his apartment and he's put in basically solitary confinement for 3 months. And it's this horrible experience. And then he's just released, and he goes home in the morning at the end of July, and the phone rings. He picks up the phone, and it's Nasser. Like, as soon as he walks home, as soon as he walks into the apartment, Nasser calls him and says, "Come to my house, right? We're gonna have lunch." And he has to go to Nasser's house as soon as he gets out of jail, and he's going there every day for lunch. And they're like talking about this and that and whatever for a month, right? And after a month, Ihsan says to Nasser, "Why are you inviting me here? Why are you making me come to your house every day for a month?" And Nasser says to him, "Because I'm giving you psychoanalytic treatment, Ihsan." Right? I mean, it's just, unimaginable, right? It's just unimaginable to think about, honestly, what a unique brand of authoritarianism Nasser had. Nasser read everything Ihsan wrote. He'd call him to make comments on each of the installments, right? He intervened in his personal life. As I cover in the book, he intervenes in his love life. And Ihsan wasn't the only one. Nasser micromanaged the intellectuals and the important public figures in ways that is just hard to fathom, right? Like, how do you run a state?
This is not unlike Trump.
Right. I mean,
it's not unlike Trump, like inviting Bill Maher to the White House. This is not that dissimilar.
I mean, what's new is old, right? I mean, it's like, in a sense, everything is in this, the book that I wrote about Ihsan it's not old, right? I mean, it should be incredibly fresh, right? And so what's important is that Nasser saw a unique opportunity in Ihsan. And so Nasser didn't want Ihsan to think that he was a competitor. He didn't want him to think that he was responsible for the revolution, right? Nasser was responsible for the revolution. But that didn't mean that Nasser didn't see Ihsan as an opportunity. Remember, Nasser is trying to construct a new culture, a new conception of masculinity, a new conception of womanhood, an entirely new culture in 1950s and the 60s. And he saw Ihsan as an incredibly unique opportunity, not just as a political commentator. And in fact, Ihsan is not distinctive at that time as a political commentator because no one is really dissenting in their political editorials anymore. And he's one of, a dozen and really important political voices, right? But he is the most popular and prolific writer of fiction. And remember, fiction, there's no social media, there's no, fractured cultural environment, right? The fiction that he's writing, everyone is reading. So Nasser sees him as this unique opportunity to use his fiction to translate the cultural priorities and ideology of Nasserism, to construct Nasserism. And so this is one reason why you have this kind of oscillating relationship between the two of them from 1954 on until the June 67 war.
I want to ask you, just change gears for a second. What did Ihsan think of other literary figures? Like, one person I wanted to ask you about was like Dorea Shafiq, who also has her own magazine and interested in women's rights. And what did he look down on people? Did he think, I'm kind of the only game in town, like all these people are?
So she actually, I'm glad you asked about her. So she actually is in Rose al Yusuf quite a bit. She writes editorials. He talks about her. And just as a side note, I am beginning a project with the Dartmouth College libraries to digitize in open access for anybody in the world the magazines of Rose al Yusuf from 1925 to 1975. And so this is going to take some time. We're going to be searching for funding for this. But at least, we have an enormous amount of the original paper issues of the magazine that we'll be scanning. And then, hopefully we'll be able to do key term searches. So, in a few years, hopefully, Mikey, you'll be able to go in and type Dorea Shafiq and find all the articles with her, over the years in that magazine. Fingers crossed on that, inshallah. But so she was someone that would kind of debate him about the role of women in society and about, women's liberation. And so, he was not as progressive as she was, right? But he still would, debate her, or he would publish articles by her, editorials by her. And so,
Can we talk about the nature of that debate? Like, what were the basis that he was supporting, and where did he disagree with people? Specifically when it came to women's rights, their engagement in society, in civic action, in the economy. Yeah.
So he's someone that it's important to understand that there's, you have to embrace all of the different contradictions here. Right. So his mother is this, blazing trailblazer of women's rights in the country. And so he certainly internalized a lot of that. And frankly, his fiction, outside of this political story that I'm talking about, is remembered for focusing on women's liberation, right? His characters are very commonly first-person narrations of women, or of young women who are falling in love and are kind of coming under the pressures and of traditional restrictions in society. And he's trying to use the tensions between, a woman falling in love, discovering her sexuality, desire, right? Romance as a vehicle for exposing these taboos and contradictions in society and repression and, certainly over women's rights. And so his fiction is very much about that. But on the other hand, almost all of his characters are part of the bourgeois milieu, which is another reason why the critics didn't like him. This was this environment of socialism and, and he's writing about the wealthy, which is kind of ironic when you think about the way that he is calling for this overthrow partly because of wealth inequality. So there's that. But he also publishes editorials in which, he basically, is not that supportive of women working in the, women in the workplace, for example. He's concerned, on a personal level, I think that he has a sense of strong traditional values that he, again, inherited from his upbringing. That, that a woman, is the mother, in these kinds of traditional categories of raising children, and, working outside of the house is something that can endanger the health of the family, and so on and so forth. So all of these kind of contradictions are there, where, he, on the one hand, is this trailblazer for presenting entirely new images of women's kind of assertiveness and following desire and individualism, right? But on the other hand, he could be writing, political, or cultural commentaries in which he, talks about, women should be supporting the family, right? So all of that is there.
Cool. I have another question that I want to talk about. Some of his pieces that were turned into films. How did he feel about Nasser taking over the Suez Canal, the nationalization of the Suez?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And actually it gets to the story that I'm trying to tell in the book, right? Which is that this is not a story of just like heroic dissent in which, Ihsan is just dissenting against Nasser through his fiction from 1954 on. I mean, he is, but on the other hand, there are also kind of swings in this pendulum in which he remembers why he loved Nasser so much, right? Or he's actively trying to please Nasser after Nasser punishes him for some, kind of dissent that he read in the fiction. And the Suez Canal crisis actually is the moment, in 56, it's the moment in which kind of, in a sense, Ihsan reverts back to his, incredible embrace of Nasser, where, he's writing this kind of, histrionic support of Nasser, taking back the Suez Canal, and let me grab a rifle, I'm going to go down and fight the British myself. And, this incredible emotional support, like, that's hard to imagine in today's environment. And I think he believes it. I don't think it's fake. I think he really believes it. But what we find is that this incredible support and this pride, that, and you also have to remember how important the Suez Canal was across the Arab world. This is the first moment that, an Arab leader has defied the West, and even if militarily it wasn't a great showing, right, on Egypt's part, it was still kind of spun into this victory. And the fact is, Egypt kept the Suez Canal, so it was a victory. And in that respect, it's hard to understate what a significant kind of historical, political, cultural moment it was that the kind of the message, the construction of a new sense of agency, a new sense of pride, of dignity that Nasser was making for the public, right? That event crystallized it. And so remember, it wasn't just the army that went down. It wasn't just the military to defend the Suez. The public went down in militias, right? The public participated in this. And I think there was this enormous groundswelling of pride, of dignity, of sense of agency, of support, and Nasser was the crystallization of that. That doesn't mean it lasted for Ihsan, but that was the moment I think that he felt incredible, in a sense, maybe a bit of relief from the nagging dread and regret and anxiety that he felt basically for most of the time after 1954.
Yeah. How did he feel about the project of Arab nationalism and sort of pan-Arabism in general?
Hugely supportive. And so when you go and you look at Rose al Yusuf, right, the magazines, the covers and the editorials, he's hugely supportive. Because
He
again,
continues to be supportive throughout his life. He thinks does it evolve? Does his relationship to that project change?
Well, to be fair, everything changes after 67. So if we can kind of go, and also to be fair, things change in the 60s. But, it's certainly up until the dissolution of the United Arab Republic, right? Up until 1961, for sure, he's hugely supportive. I mean, he actually says, he actually will later say, I was not supportive of union with Syria. And the reason for that wasn't an ideological reason. It was that Egypt needed development on the national level, before we could, have a strong union with another Arab country. And that's something he'll say, for many, many years. But ideologically, remember, this is the opportunity to show that I didn't just embed a military dictatorship, right? That, in other words, the coming of Nasser meant a new conception of Arab identity, a new Arab consciousness. And that's the term he uses repeatedly, al-wa'i, right? He says repeatedly that there's a new consciousness here. And it gave him an opportunity to, I think to focus on a sense of Arab strength, right? In a period in which he's clearly feeling intense anxiety about what's happening on this kind of domestic level in Egypt.
Yeah. Did he talk about, like in his later, or in his journals or his letters or in interviews, did he talk about why he liked to write about sex and romance and stuff like that in his fiction so much?
Well, so this, of course, if you go back to even his earliest short stories, they're full of sexual scandal. And he would say things, and he became known in the 1940s as the writer of the bed, which was a pejorative, right? At this time, this was a conservative society. And so he was someone who was, seen as by many, by kind of respectable society as writing smut, right?
Is it because,
And,
Jonathan, I want to ask you for a second, just about his personality. I mean, like, was he this like flamboyant guy? I feel like when I see pictures of him, he seems like this buttoned up guy. He doesn't seem particularly flamboyant. He doesn't seem like he would be interested in writing smut, as you said, like this sort of raunchy romance novels. Basically, he doesn't seem like this type of guy.
I mean, to be fair, again, this is not smut by our standards at all. This
Okay.
is just, this is kind of romantic melodrama in the 50s. And when you compare it to Hollywood cinema of the 40s and 50s, there's nothing extraordinary about it at all. So, I just want to be really clear. It's melodrama. It's romantic melodrama in which there are some passages that go pretty far, right? That would certainly have been shocking for the time, right? No doubt. And by the way, just as a side note, one of the things that's lovely reading these things in the original context of the magazine is that the magazine would publish reader letters, responses to what happened last installment or the installment
It's
before.
the comment
And so
section.
the comments, right? And those letters are just amazing. I mean, you get a sense at, what were the kind of cultural mores of the time, right? By what it was that just exploded the comments, right? Or the letters that people would write in. So I think it's important to remember that he's playing many different roles, right? He's embodying many different positions. He's very famous. By the time you get to the 50s and especially the 60s, he's a true celebrity, right? He's very famous, and he's the editor-in-chief of the magazine. That's his major role. And so the fiction, he loved the fiction, and I think he saw the fiction as his therapy. But the fiction for him was, I don't know that he would say this, but I think it's pretty clear that, or he would have said this, but this is pretty clear, is that the fiction for him was the way to increase sales, circulation. And so that's why so many of the chapters end in some kind of cliffhanger. That's why, you kind of get these sensational things, from time to time, these really, shocking scenes. But he saw himself as the editor-in-chief of a magazine or the owner of a magazine, and fiction was part of a larger, puzzle, right, of what his life was, or a larger, kind of collage of what his life, or ecosystem of what his life was. But he was someone who was out in the town. Remember, he was someone who was friends with all the directors and all the actors and actresses and all the other journalists and the politicians and so on and so forth. So that's important to understand, this multiplicity of roles that he's playing.
So the last question I want to ask you is, if you were to, I haven't asked you about any specific films yet. So if you were to give me your like top 5 or top 3 works, films, books, whatever you want, what are top 3 or top 5?
Okay, so one of the things to understand about Ihsan is that, of course, everyone knows him in the Arab world, but no one knows him in the English-speaking world. And the reason for that is that the critics hated him, right? And so his stuff was never translated except for one book published by the Egyptian ministry in the 1970s. Like nothing was translated into English. So part of this project was not just publishing this book, right? But it was also translating for the first time a couple of his major works. So in English, I translated first I Do Not Sleep, which is this classic melodrama of the 1950s, amazing, um, a family melodrama with shocking scenes in the 1950s. And then
Which
another one that
the movie poster is
and the
is
movie
behind your left
poster
shoulder.
exactly is that an M. This is the Sleepless. And then the other translation that just came out recently is A Nose and Three Eyes, which was this was his moment of true dissent against Nasser in fiction, where he really breaks from Nasser in 1963 and 64. And Hanan al-Sheikh, of course, the incredibly famous Lebanese novelist, she had a relationship with him at the time that he was writing this. And she very generously wrote the foreword to the translation as a kind of memoir of her time with him, because he writes her as a character in the book. Um, and so those are the two, of course, in English that I recommend. You can find some of the films with subtitles. If you can find I Do Not Sleep or La Anam with English subtitles, it's incredible with Fatin Hamama and Omar Sharif. And, it's just an incredible, incredible film. But he has so many, again, 49 Egyptian films were based on his fiction. From, My Father's Up a Tree to There's a Man in Our House to, I'm Free to many, many others.
Amazing. Okay, cool. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much. I really, really appreciate it. I feel like we could keep on talking for another hour, but I'll stop here. And maybe we'll feature some of those translated books in both English and Arabic in our book club. But thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
What a pleasure. What an honor, Mikey. Fantastic podcast. I'm just truly honored to be able to be a part of it.